The projector hummed softly as the living room lights dimmed. Everyone fell silent. The cake sat untouched on the table, its gold frosting reading 50 years of love. My granddaughter's eyes sparkled, expecting a slideshow of old family photos. My wife of 50 years, Judith, sat beside me, her hand on my arm, smiling like nothing was wrong. I pressed the button on the remote. The first video flickered onto the wall. A hotel room. She was there. In a red robe. With him. They laughed. They kissed. The room went quiet. I didn't speak. I just let the images do it for me. Judith froze. Her smile dropped. My son looked at me, then at her. My daughter-in-law covered her mouth. 5 years. 5 long years I waited. I recorded. I documented. I never confronted her. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just watched. Every time she left the house to see her sister or go shopping, I tracked her. Cameras. GPS voice recorders. The truth, piece by piece. And now it was time. I still remember the first time I knew something was wrong. It was the summer of 2020. We had just celebrated our 45th anniversary. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and told me she was going to visit her friend, Martha, upstate. But when I looked at her car GPS history later that night, she hadn't gone north. She had gone west. To a small town 2 hours away. I didn't say anything. I just made a mental note. The next week, I placed a tracker in her purse. I bought a small voice recorder online, the kind private investigators use. I taught myself how to install hidden cameras. I started saving every receipt, every bank transaction. I checked her phone when she was asleep. One night, she came home late, smelling of cheap motel shampoo. I hugged her and whispered, "Long day?" She smiled and said, "Traffic was awful." She had no idea. He was a man named Carl. Divorced. Worked construction. Balding. Tattoos on both arms. The kind of man who drank light beer at noon and called women sweetheart. I had seen him once, back in 2019, at a neighborhood barbecue. I remember shaking his hand and offering him a beer. He said, "You got any whiskey?" and winked at Judith. I didn't think much of it then. But over the years, I learned everything about him. Where he lived. Where he worked. Who he owed money to. Who his ex-wife was. What his weaknesses were. And Judith, she thought she was being clever. Burner phones. Cash payments. She even created a fake Facebook profile under the name Linda Kay. But nothing escapes a man who has lost trust. By 2022, I had compiled nearly 300 hours of footage. Video. Audio. Photos. Text messages. Conversations. Every lie she told me, every fake smile, every "I love you" before slipping out the door to him. And I waited. I waited because I knew this wasn't just about revenge. This was about truth. About showing my family, my children, my grandchildren, who she really was. Not the woman who made pot roast every Sunday. Not the loving wife she pretended to be. The real her. So I planned it. The 50th anniversary party. Rented the hall. Invited everyone. Hired a caterer. Even printed those stupid gold balloons. I smiled through it all. Played the role. Gave her flowers. Held her hand. She had no idea. Back in the living room, the second video played. She was in our bed this time. Laughing. Naked. He was behind the camera. She said, "I love you more than I ever loved him." My grandson stood up and shouted, "What the hell is this?" I stayed seated. Calm. I looked at Judith and said, "Tell them." She didn't speak. Her face was pale. Her lips trembling. I pressed the button again. Another video. And another. I had 30 lined up. And this was just the beginning. Judith didn't speak. Her hand dropped from my arm, her fingers trembling slightly as the fourth video ended. The room was silent, suffocating. You could hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. My daughter's eyes were filled with tears. My grandson looked like he wanted to break something. I stood up slowly, not in anger, but with the kind of calm that comes when a man has already died inside years ago. I looked across the room, my family, my blood, and said only 5 words. She's been doing this for years. That's when Judith finally whispered, "David, please stop." But I didn't stop. Not yet. I turned to her and said, "Do you remember the necklace you lost in 2021? The one I bought for our 40th anniversary? I found it. Under the passenger seat of Carl's truck." Her eyes widened. "Or the scarf you said you left at the salon? It was wrapped around his bedpost. I have pictures." She looked like she wanted to disappear. But she stayed seated, surrounded by family she once fooled, now frozen in disbelief. I turned to the others. "You want to know how long this has been going on?" "Since July 2020. Almost 5 full years. I have footage from 17 different motels, 2 Airbnbs, and 1 cabin in the mountains. You want timestamps? I have them. You want receipts? I've got those too." My son shook his head, clearly nauseated. He muttered, "Mom, why?" She didn't answer. Because what could she say? That she was lonely? That she needed attention? That after 45 years she suddenly realized she wanted something else? She knew I would have given her anything, attention, change, even therapy, if she had just asked. But instead, she gave herself to another man and wore my trust like a mask. I didn't plan to humiliate her at first. My original intention was simple: I understand what was going on. But the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't just one mistake. This was a double life. She laughed with him. She made fun of me. In one of the clips, she said, "He's so boring, Carl. All he does is watch the History Channel and talk about the lawn." That hit harder than any slap. Because I remembered every time I mowed that lawn, carefully. Every Sunday. Because she liked how it looked. I didn't care about the grass. I cared about her. The camera feed I installed in our guest bedroom wasn't high resolution, but it didn't need to be. It caught enough. Him entering. Her undressing. Her calling him baby. I labeled each file, dated them, saved them to 3 separate hard drives. I didn't want a single second lost. In 2023, I went further. I hired a private investigator to follow her on trips I couldn't track. I wanted a third-party confirmation. And I got it, full dossiers, complete with photos, reports, even license plate records. There was one night she told me she was volunteering at the women's shelter. The investigator's photo showed her kissing Carl outside a motel 2 hours south. She came home that night, kissed me, and said, "The shelter girls really needed someone to talk to today." The amount of detail in her lies? It wasn't a fling. It was a strategy. But this, tonight, was my strategy. I waited until every child, grandchild, cousin, neighbor, and friend was in the room. Because I wanted the truth to burn away her mask in front of the very people she had tricked. She built an identity as a devoted wife and mother. And I let her. Until now. My daughter finally spoke. "Dad, what happens now?" I paused. Because that was a good question. What happens when the truth is finally laid bare? I looked at Judith. She didn't look like my wife anymore. Not the woman who danced with me in the kitchen. Not the woman who cried with me when our first dog died. This person sitting here was a stranger in my wife's skin. I said, "Tomorrow, I'll be moving out. The house is in my name. You have 48 hours to pack. I've already filed for divorce. The lawyer will be contacting you." She gasped. "And Carl?" I added. "He'll be getting a package too, copies of everything. Along with a friendly letter to his employer. You see, he works government contracts. They don't like scandal." I turned to the rest of the room. I know this is hard to watch. But I won't let my silence make me complicit anymore. She chose this path. I just turned on the lights. Then, for the first time, I saw her cry. Not a single tear before that. But now, her face crumbled. Her hands shook. She tried to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse. But nothing came out. I picked up the remote. One more video. The last one. The final video started playing, and the room braced for more. This one was different, though. It wasn't sexual. It wasn't filmed in a motel or our bedroom. It was a quiet conversation, caught by a voice recorder I had left under the backseat of her car. Judith's voice came through, calm, calculated. "I'm not leaving him yet," she said. "Not until the paperwork goes through." Carl laughed. "You think he'll sign it?" "I'll make him. He's soft. He's always been soft." That was the moment I decided to burn everything down. The audio ended. I turned off the projector. The lights came back on. Judith was no longer crying. She looked hollow. The mask had been peeled off, and now all that remained was the shame. I didn't speak for a long moment. I just looked at my family. Each of them wore a different expression: sadness, anger, shock, disgust. But none of them looked at her the same. That was the price of betrayal, and not just losing love, but losing respect. Then I walked over to the table and picked up the gold-foiled anniversary card she had written me. On the front it said, "To my forever love." Inside, she had written, "You are the greatest man I've ever known. Here's to 50 more." I held it up and said, "Lies written in cursive." Then I ripped it in half. She whispered, "David, please." I shook my head. "You had 5 years to say please. 5 years to come clean. 5 years to stop. But you didn't. You chose him. You chose this." She started to stand. I gestured for her to sit. "No," I said firmly. "You going to listen now?" I turned to my son and daughter. "I need you both to know this wasn't easy. I thought about this night for years. I wondered if it was worth it, if tearing the family apart was the right thing to do. But then I realized, it wasn't me tearing it apart. She already did that. I'm just showing you what was under the surface." My daughter wiped her face and said, "Dad, I'm sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," I replied. "None of this is on you." Then I turned back to Judith. "You remember our trip to Niagara Falls? 1988, you wore that yellow raincoat. We stood under the mist and you kissed me like we were 20 again. I held on to that memory every time things got hard. I thought it meant something." "It did," she said, her voice small. "No. It doesn't anymore. Because when you betray someone that deeply, every memory becomes poisoned. Every smile becomes a lie. Every "I love you" echoes with sarcasm." She covered her face with her hands. "I used to think," I continued, that growing old together meant holding hands through everything. Sickness. Loss. Pain. I never expected the worst part of aging would be realizing the person you loved most was a stranger. The silence was unbearable. Even the kids didn't know what to say. Judith was finally, truly broken. But I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I felt free. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was everything: printouts, photos, audio transcripts, legal documents. I tossed it on the table in front of her. "That's for you. For the lawyer. And for Carl, too." I made a copy for his boss. She looked at it like it was a bomb. "You can keep the ring," I added. "I don't want it. It means nothing now." The guests had started leaving. Some quietly. Some hugging me. A few whispered apologies, though they owed me none. My son stayed. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You didn't deserve this." "No one does," I said. As I packed a small overnight bag, Judith followed me to the door. Her voice cracked. "Where will you go?" I looked at her for what felt like the last time. "Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere where the silence doesn't lie." Then I walked out. The night air hit me like a wave. It was cool, clean. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The motel wasn't much. A faded sign, peeling paint, a vending machine that only took quarters. But the room was clean, the bed firm, and the silence real. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the duffel bag I'd packed in under 10 minutes. Just the basics. I didn't need much. I never had. For 50 years, my life had been wrapped around a woman I thought I knew. Now it was just me, and I was fine with that. The phone buzzed. Text from my son: "Let me know if you need anything. Love you, Dad." I replied, "Thank you. I'm okay. I promise." And I was. I didn't cry. I didn't drink. I didn't scream into the night or question my worth. That part had already passed, years ago, when I first suspected her. Grief was a process, and I had been grieving my marriage for 5 long years in silence. Now, I was working on the aftermath. The next morning, I got coffee from a diner down the road. Old waitress, bright smile, called everyone hun. She asked if I wanted cream. I said yes, and for a second, I felt normal. I opened my laptop, connected to the motel Wi-Fi, and pulled up the folder labeled Final. Inside were all the files, evidence of the affair, copies of conversations, videos, voice memos. Everything I hadn't shown the family. There were things too dark for them to see. Comments Judith made in passing that revealed how deeply she'd fallen for Carl. Jokes at my expense. Private mockery. She wasn't just cheating, she was rewriting our entire history. Laughing about it. One clip still haunted me. "I used to fake it every single time," she'd told him. Even on our honeymoon. He never noticed. Carl laughed. I closed the file. I wasn't a fool. I wasn't weak. But I was human. And hearing the person you built your life around devalue you in ways you can't defend against, that leaves a mark no one else sees. Still, I had work to do. I opened a second folder, labeled Action. Carl wasn't just some drunk loser. He owned a small construction company, worked on city contracts, and got most of his business through referrals and reputation. He had a license from the state. That license could be revoked with the right documentation. Lucky for me, he wasn't careful. He used fake invoices. Hired unlicensed labor. Cut corners on multiple properties, and I had proof. Not because I went digging. Because Carl was sloppy. And I had Judith's phone mirrored for 2 years. Photos. Messages. Brags. I told the city inspector I fixed the wiring, he wrote in one message. Didn't touch it. Saved me $3,000. I compiled a report. Included the video of him admitting to bribing an inspector. Added timestamps, project addresses, and employee statements. I knew exactly where to send it, the state licensing board, his biggest client, and an investigative journalist friend I hadn't spoken to in years. I wasn't just going to expose their affair. I was going to bury him. And Judith? She had always taken pride in her image, the golden grandmother, the charity volunteer, the voice of the women's committee at church. I had copies of every lie she told the charity board. About where she spent her hours. About where donations were going. She had funneled over $12,000 into her personal account under the guise of logistics. She thought no one noticed. I noticed. I printed out the statements. Highlighted the discrepancies. Cross-referenced volunteer logs and her own GPS history. Another file. Another envelope. By the end of the week, 3 packages were in the mail. One to Carl's company's biggest client. One to the charity board. One to an ethics review panel tied to the church. No screaming. No public spectacle. Just cold, quiet devastation. I didn't need to watch their lives fall apart. I just needed to know they would. That night, I sat in the motel room, the window open, breeze flowing in. I thought about my past. About the man I had been. Loyal. Consistent. Predictable. The kind of man who brought flowers on Thursdays just because. Who paid bills on time. Who fixed the sink, mowed the lawn, changed the oil. And I realized something. They didn't break me. They freed me. Judith's betrayal cut deep, yes. But it also pulled me out of a life where I had been living on autopilot, thinking love was routine. Thinking marriage meant inertia. Now, I had choices again. I finished my coffee. Sat down to write one final letter, not to Judith, not to Carl, but to myself. It began with a simple sentence. You made it out. The first call came 3 days later. I was walking out of the diner, same place, same coffee, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I picked up, expecting maybe a solicitor or a wrong dial. But the voice on the other end was tight, frantic. Mr. Carson, the man asked. Yes? This is Greg Walters, legal counsel for Newbridge Construction. We received a package with some rather serious allegations concerning one of our subcontractors. A Carl Hendricks. I said nothing. Do you have any further evidence to support what you sent? I smiled slightly. Plenty. And it's not an allegation. It's proof. There was a pause. Then, would you be willing to speak to our compliance officer? Already did. The package was sent to him too. Click. That was the first domino. By the next morning, Carl's name was off the contractor list on the city registry. 2 of his ongoing renovation projects had been paused pending investigation. I didn't need to be there. I knew how these things worked. The paperwork, the chain reaction, the slow public drowning. I watched it all from the comfort of a motel room with beige curtains and a dusty TV. But Carl wasn't the only one. That evening, a different call. This time it was from Judith's church. Mr. Carson, this is Margaret from St. Luke's Council. I don't know how to say this, but we've received some very troubling documents about Judith's use of charitable funds. I kept my tone neutral. That's so? They show transfers to her personal account. And she logged hours at the shelter when the GPS says she was elsewhere. Is there a question? I asked. Margaret hesitated. We'll need to suspend her from the board, pending internal review. I said, that's your business. But if you want the raw data, timestamps, and full audio records, I can provide those too. Another silence. Please do. I emailed the files within the hour. I had no joy in it. No celebration. It was like checking off boxes in a long to-do list of justice. That night, my son came to visit. He knocked on the motel room door carrying a six-pack and a bag of takeout. No words at first. He just sat on the bed beside me and handed me a burger. You okay? He finally asked. Better every day. He nodded. Mom's freaking out. The church told her today. She's been calling everyone trying to fix it. Let her, I said. Let her explain where the money went. She wants to talk to you. I shook my head. There's nothing left to say. My son didn't argue. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me, and said something I hadn't expected. I didn't realize how strong you were until this. That hit me harder than I let on. Most men live their lives in the background. Providers. Workers. Quiet soldiers of the everyday. But betrayal reveals something. It strips away pretense, leaving only your core. And mine, as I was learning, was made of steel. I changed the subject. How's Emma? I asked about my granddaughter. She's confused. Hurt. But she saw it all. She doesn't blame you. Good. I didn't need their pity. I needed their clarity. The next morning, I received a message from Carl. A text, just one sentence, we need to talk. I didn't respond. 2 hours later, another, you went too far. No, Carl. I didn't go far enough. Then came the email from Judith. Subject line, please. Inside, David. Please talk to me. I made a mistake. I'm losing everything. Can we just meet? I didn't reply. There was a time I would have jumped at a message like that. Begged to fix things. Asked what I did wrong. But not anymore. Because I finally understood, it wasn't about me. It never was. It was about her choices. Her willingness to lie. To cheat. To deceive every person who ever trusted her. I checked the court status online. The divorce paperwork had been received and was being processed. The house, under my name, would legally return to me within a month. She'd have to find somewhere else to live. And Carl? Without his licenses and with a public record of fraud, he'd be lucky to fix sinks for cash. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice. Simple, cold, overdue. I sat outside the motel that night, watching cars pass. A teenage couple walked by, holding hands. She leaned into him, laughing. He looked at her like she was his whole world. I wondered how long it would last. Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, it cuts both ways. But as I sipped my coffee, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The house was quiet when I returned. It always had a certain stillness in the early morning, before the sun touched the curtains and the air warmed with life. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, keys in hand, letting the silence settle around me like a familiar coat. Judith wasn't there. The lawyer had delivered the notice, and she had followed instructions. 48 hours, just like I said. She packed and left. I didn't know where she went, and I didn't care. For the first time in 50 years, the house was mine alone. I walked through each room like I was visiting the ghost of my past. The living room still had the indentation on the couch where she always Saturday. The kitchen smelled faintly of her perfume. The master bedroom, that one I didn't linger in. Too much history. Too many memories now soaked in poison. I went to the office and opened the drawer where I kept the deed. Pulled it out, ran my fingers over the paper. My name. Mine. That meant more now than it ever did. The phone rang mid-afternoon. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me, and I listened. It was Carl. "David," he said, voice low and forced calm, "we both know you've made your point. You took everything from me, my work, my contracts, my reputation. You're a smart guy. But this isn't over. Men like me don't stay down long." I replayed the message. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear the sound of a man who just lost the game. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a gambler without a table left to play on. That same night, Judith sent another email. This one longer. A rambling mess of apologies, rationalizations, and regret. She said she didn't know why she did what she did. Said she was confused. Lonely. That she made mistakes but still loved me. Mistakes? 5 years of deception. Fake names. Money theft. Humiliation. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. Over and over again. I didn't reply. The next day, I visited the family lawyer to finalize the property transfer. I signed the last form, shook hands, and stepped outside into the sunlight. It felt different now. Not warmer, not brighter. Just clearer. The world looked honest again. I drove by the church, not to go in, but to park across the street and observe. Word had spread. Judith's absence from the weekly gathering was already a topic. I saw familiar faces entering, some casting cautious glances at the empty parking spot where she used to leave her car. That spot now felt like a monument to her fall. Later that evening, I visited my granddaughter Emma. She was the one I worried about most. She was young, still forming her understanding of love, trust, and family. I didn't want this to ruin her view of relationships. She hugged me tightly when I arrived. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she said. "I don't understand any of it." I nodded. "You're not supposed to. Adults mess things up sometimes. Even the ones we think are perfect." She lied to us. "Yes," I said. "But that doesn't mean you stop believing in truth. It means you learn to recognize it better." She looked at me. "Are you okay?" I paused, then said, "I'm getting there." We played cards for an hour, talked about her classes, her friends, her dreams. And I realized something powerful in that moment. I hadn't just survived this betrayal. I had grown through it. There was no going back to who I was before, but that was a good thing. Driving home, I passed a billboard for a local construction firm. Carl's old company. The sign was torn, the logo peeled halfway off. Temporary, unplanned decay, but fitting. Everything he touched was crumbling, just like his lies. When I got back, there was a package at my door. No return address. Inside, an envelope with photographs. Me. Sitting in the diner. Standing outside the motel. Talking to my son. All taken from a distance. No note. Just the photos. It wasn't subtle. It was a message. Carl, or someone acting for him, was watching me. Trying to spook me. I sat at the kitchen table, photos spread out. Stared at them for a long time. Not out of fear, but strategy. Because if Carl thought intimidation would work, then he truly didn't understand who I had become. I made a call. My lawyer knew a retired state trooper who ran a private security service. Within 24 hours, I had motion lights installed, a new camera system surrounding the house, and someone on standby who handled things quietly. This wasn't about escalating. It was about finishing what I started, with clean lines and a clear conscience. Let them watch. Let them know I see them now. The game was still on, but I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was the one holding the board. The next week passed like the quiet before a storm. I went about my days with measured calm, but underneath, I was alert. Focused. Every sound outside the window, every unfamiliar car idling at the curb, every pause in the phone line when I answered, I noticed everything. And I documented it. I wasn't afraid. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. Then, it happened. Emma called me, voice shaky. "Grandpa, there was a man outside my school today. He was in a truck. He didn't say anything, but he was just sitting there, watching. When I walked out, he drove off." My jaw clenched. "Did you get the license plate?" "No, I was scared. But it looked like Carl's truck. I think I've seen it before." I told her to go straight home and stay inside. I called her father, my son, and within 10 minutes, we had the school alerted, the police informed, and Emma escorted home. Carl had crossed the line. This wasn't about me anymore. He was pushing into my family space. He was trying to rattle the one part of me I hadn't used against him, my heart. So I made a decision. It was time to finish this. That night, I pulled out the black notebook I hadn't opened in months. It contained every name, date, account, and contact from 5 years of watching. It also contained one file I had never touched, until now. Inside were records I had pulled from a court database years ago, Carl's sealed domestic violence charges from a previous marriage. Nothing had ever stuck. His ex-wife dropped the charges, probably out of fear, or money. But the patterns were there. Enough to scare off any potential employer if the right summary landed in the right inbox. I spent the next 2 days gathering every detail, turning it into a clean, concise report, with just enough truth to be undeniable and just enough implication to be terrifying. Then I hired a courier. Not a digital transfer. Not a traceable email. An envelope, hand-delivered, anonymous. Where? To Carl's 2 newest clients. To his bank loan officer. To the PDA board where his new girlfriend served. And finally, to his ex-wife, with a note. Some things deserve to be heard. He hasn't changed. That last one wasn't revenge. It was a warning. By the end of the week, the buzz had started. My son's friend who worked in zoning told me Carl's permits were being reviewed. He might lose his license permanently. Not because I said so. Because the record was finally speaking louder than the man. Judith, meanwhile, had moved in with a cousin out of state. She had tried to call my daughter, to explain. The call lasted less than a minute. She was told not to contact the family again. She sent me one last email. This time, no apology. Just a question, was it worth it? I didn't answer her directly. But I opened a new document and typed. Yes. Because now, I sleep. That Saturday, I hosted dinner for my son and his family. My first time cooking for them alone. I grilled steaks, made mashed potatoes, set out cold beers. We sat in the backyard, the one I used to mow every Sunday, the same one Judith used to say was a waste of time. Emma gave me a hug before dessert and said, "You're stronger than anyone I know." I didn't tear up. I just nodded and said, "You get that strength when life stops being polite." As the sun went down, my son asked, "Is it really over?" I paused. "Not yet," I said. "There's one more thing." Because I wasn't just cleaning up after betrayal. I was preparing for closure. And closure sometimes needs to be carved, not granted. Sunday morning came with clear skies and the kind of stillness that usually promises peace. But not that day. That day was for reckoning. I had made my final preparations the night before, every detail laid out, every possible response accounted for. What I was about to do wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it would leave a mark neither Judith nor Carl would ever escape. I drove 2 hours west to a town where no one knew my name. There, in a quiet little office above a laundromat, worked someone I'd met once before, a private investigator turned data broker, the kind of man who specialized in digital reclamation. He wasn't cheap. But nothing meaningful ever is. I handed him a flash drive. He plugged it in, opened the files, and raised an eyebrow. "You want this public?" "No," I said. "I want it irreversible." He nodded. "I can do that." On that drive home, I felt lighter. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just certain. There was no more waiting, no more calculating. I had already exposed their affair, stripped Carl of his business, forced Judith into exile. But this next part, this was about legacy. They had tried to bury me in silence. I would bury them in truth. That evening, my phone rang again, not Carl, not Judith. It was a reporter. Local, persistent. "Mr. Carson, I'm doing a piece on fraudulent contractors and ethics in local construction. Your name came up in relation to Mr. Hendricks. Care to comment?" I paused. "Only off the record," I said. She agreed. I gave her just enough, documentation, evidence, the ethical violations, the community risk. Never mentioned the affair, never said my wife's name. Because this wasn't about scandal anymore. This was about principles. And principles don't need shouting, they stand on their own. 2 days later, the article hit. Headline: A local contractor accused of fraud, bribery, and unsafe practices, investigation underway. By noon, Carl's remaining contracts had frozen. By 3 p.m., the city issued a formal review notice. And by the next morning, his business was done. He sent me a voicemail that day. I didn't even listen to it. I just saved it in a folder titled Closure. Then came the final stroke. I contacted Judith's former charity board under a pseudonym and submitted an anonymous request for an audit, citing specific transactions and timeline overlaps with her known activity logs. I knew they'd connect the dots. And once they did, she wouldn't just be removed, she'd be discredited permanently in any future nonprofit work. Why? Because some lies stain paper, and others stain names. The silence that followed was my reward. No more emails. No more threats. Just nothing. And nothing, in a war like this, is the sweetest sound. A week passed. I mowed the lawn. Cleaned the gutters. Reorganized the garage. Simple things, ordinary things, the life I had built slowly reclaiming its shape. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, I found an old photo album. It had dust on it thick enough to coat my fingers. Inside were pictures of Judith and me, our wedding, our first house, Emma's birth. I stared at those faces. I didn't hate them. I just didn't recognize them anymore. That night, I made a decision. I packed every photo, every frame, every shared memory that no longer served me, and put them in a box labeled Gone. I drove to the edge of town, to a quiet wooded clearing where we used to picnic, and I left the box there. Not to burn it. Not to destroy it. Just to let it rest. Far away from the life I was building now. As I drove home, the radio played a soft country tune. The kind Judith used to hum while cleaning. I turned the volume down. Enough ghosts for one day. I got back, poured a glass of whiskey, first in a long time, and stepped out onto the porch. The stars were out, and the air was cool. The world hadn't changed. But I had. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was clean. And they, Carl and Judith, they were the ones left carrying rot in their pockets. That rot would follow them everywhere. In every job interview. Every church gathering. Every awkward silence when their names came up. They had their affair. Now they had each other, and nothing else. The envelope came in the mail on a Thursday. No name, no return address. Just my name, printed in plain black letters on the front. I opened it slowly, carefully. Inside were two things, a photo and a handwritten letter. The photo showed Carl. He was sitting on a park bench, alone, head in his hands. His beard was longer, unkempt. His boots scuffed. He looked smaller somehow, deflated, like someone had drained the arrogance from him and left only skin and regret. The letter was in Judith's handwriting. David. I know you won't read this, but I have to try. Carl left. Said I ruined his life. I'm staying in my cousin's basement. No job, no car. People whisper when I go to the store. My church has asked me not to return. I made mistakes. I know that word means nothing now, but it's all I have. I thought I was chasing freedom. Excitement. Something new. But all I found was silence. You won. You took everything from me. And I deserve it. But I want you to know, I think about you every day. Not the man who exposed me, but the man I betrayed. I'm sorry, David. For everything. Judith. I folded the letter once, then again, and set it on the table. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. Because even now, after everything, she still didn't understand. I didn't win anything. This wasn't a contest. There were no trophies. I didn't destroy her, she did that. I just stopped shielding her from the consequences. And Carl? He had vanished. Left her in the wreckage he helped build. Classic coward. The kind of man who stirs the fire, then runs when it burns too hot. But their choices were their own. Mine was different. I made one final stop that day, the bank. Inside, I met with the branch manager, an older woman named Helen who had known me and Judith for years. She was kind but professional. Mr. Carson, are you sure you want to close the joint account? Yes, I said. Make the transfer to my name only. She can keep the other account. What's left of it? Helen nodded. Understood. With that, the last financial tie was severed. Later that afternoon, I walked through town. No destination, just motion. People I'd known for decades passed by, some nodding respectfully, others looking away, unsure of what to say. I didn't blame them. My story had become local folklore. The quiet man who'd lived 50 years with a liar and brought down her whole world in silence. I stopped at a small bookstore and bought a novel. Something new. Something unconnected to anything I'd lived. When I paid, the cashier smiled. You look peaceful, she said. I nodded. I feel it. That evening, I returned home and stood in the doorway again, just like I had the day I came back for the first time alone. But this time, it felt different. Less like stepping into a memory, more like stepping out of one. I walked through the house slowly. No more ghosts. No more what ifs. Only now. I sat at the kitchen table, poured myself a drink, and pulled out a pen. I started writing, not a letter, not a plan. Just thoughts. For me. For the man who had endured all of it and never broke. I wrote. I was never weak. I was loyal. I was never blind. I was patient. I was never cold. I was calculating. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. Silence was the chamber where I loaded the bullet. I closed the journal, placed it back in the drawer, and went to the backyard. The stars were bright. The kind of brightness you don't notice until everything else is finally quiet. I sat on the porch, the night air cool on my skin, and I let the quiet fill me. This was it. Not the end. The beginning. 3 months passed. The seasons shifted. The air grew cooler. Leaves turned gold, orange, and red, covering the streets like soft reminders that nothing stays the same forever. Time didn't ask for permission to move forward, it just did. And I let it carry me with it. The house was different now. Same walls, same roof, but a different energy. The photos were gone. The air was lighter. The silence no longer pressed down like a weight, it breathed with me. Each morning I brewed coffee for 1. Not 2. And it tasted better that way. My days became simple again. I walked. I read. I volunteered at the local community center twice a week, teaching a basic woodworking class to young men, most of them without fathers, without guidance. They listened. They respected me. Not because I was loud, but because I was steady. They didn't know my story. I didn't need them to. What mattered was that I had something to offer. That I wasn't just a man who had been betrayed, I was a man who had built himself again, plank by plank, day by day. One Saturday, while I was loading supplies into my truck at the hardware store, I saw a familiar car across the lot. Older Toyota. Windows down. Inside, a face I hadn't seen in years, Carl's ex-wife, Rachel. She stepped out, noticed me, and hesitated. Then she walked over. "David," she said. "Rachel." "I got your letter," she said. "About Carl." I nodded. "Figured you should know what he's been up to." "I always knew he was poison. I just couldn't prove it." "Now you can." She looked at me for a moment, like she was seeing me for the first time. "You know," she said, "he always said you were boring." I laughed quietly. He wasn't the first. But here you are. And I heard he's living in a trailer downstate. No work. Drinking again. I'm not surprised. She smiled, not cruelly, just knowingly. Funny how things turn. We parted without ceremony. Just a nod, two people who survived the same hurricane from opposite sides. That evening, I grilled a steak, opened a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving, and sat on the back porch. My phone buzzed. A message from my son? "Dinner tomorrow? Emma wants to show you her art project." I replied, "I wouldn't miss it." Then I leaned back, looked up at the stars, clearer than ever, and let the silence take over. But not empty silence. Peaceful silence. Earned silence. Because here's the truth no one tells you about betrayal: it doesn't define you. It reveals you. And what it revealed in me wasn't weakness, or rage, or desperation. It revealed patience. Strategy. Strength. It revealed that I didn't need revenge to feel whole, I needed truth. And when that truth came out, it didn't scream. It whispered. "You're free now." Judith never tried to contact me again. Not after the last letter. I heard through someone at church that she was working part-time in another town, helping with elderly care. I hoped she found something real in that. Not forgiveness. Not redemption. Just something honest. As for Carl, no job, no home, no name left worth mentioning. Last I heard, he'd gotten into a bar fight and was kicked out of a shelter for stealing food. They both burned down their lives chasing something that didn't exist. And I just stood still and let the fire pass. You see, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need fists or threats. I just needed to wait, and strike when the truth weighed more than their lies. They built their house on sand. I built mine on stone. And now, as I sat alone under a sky full of stars, with the smell of grilled meat in the air and the weight of my past finally off my shoulders, I realized something. She was never my home. I was my own home all along.